Good morning, welcome everybody. I'm John White. I have the pleasure of working in one of our shops, the Windsor store, part-time there. And amongst other things, I keep bees, like some of you, many of you hopefully. And my first love in beekeeping is definitely keeping bees without having to have any sort of chemical intervention. So the subject of my talk today is small cell foundation, and that is just one of many ways of managing bees without chemicals. There's other methods: integrated pest management, breeding for varroa sensitive hygienic behavior. Some people even install a bee gym, which has mixed reviews, but my thing is definitely a small cell foundation. So I'm sure a few of you will have heard of this program, Greg Foot's Sliced Bread or BS. So the last time I gave this talk, I've given this talk a few times, I thought I'll be a little bit cute. I'll mix it up. I'll throw something like this in. So I said, look, I gave a premise about what small cell is, which is effectively one method of keeping bees without using chemicals. And I said, we're going to have a vote whether this is sliced bread or BS. And a very nice lady at the back of the audience shot her hand into the air and she said, excuse me, sir, excuse me, can you just tell me what BS is? So it just completely took the wind out of my sail. So as I said to her, and if any of you are unsure, just ask the person next to you. So sliced bread. So my premise is that small cell foundation, not having to use chemicals, I think it's the best thing since sliced bread. So what do you think? Let me have a show of hands. If it works, is small cell sliced bread? In a show of hands, who might be willing to give this a chance or think it might be a possibility? Resounding silence. Yeah, no, that's fine. BS? Good, that's good. It's good to have a healthy challenge and some in between. Brilliant. That's, well, it may be. So what is small cell? The small cell is essentially foundation, regular foundation. Wax can be wax or plastic, and it's literally the cell size is 10% smaller, so it's 4.9 mil. So we've got lots of it downstairs, wired, unwired, all frame sizes. There's a couple of packets that I've brought up here, and it's a kind of tricky. You have to put them side by side and get close up and personal, but you can actually spot the difference, and you can do that afterwards, or you can go downstairs and have a look. Small cell foundation. So it's literally smaller cell, 4.9 mils. And we sell it, Thorne's manufacture it. Previously, I had to get it originally from America through Man Lake, which then became Bee Equipment. They were the only sources of it, both plastic and in wax. More recently, before Thorne started manufacturing it, you still can buy it from Sweden, Germany. There's some nice wax, organic wax. Some friends of mine, they buy it from Sweden. And what's interesting with small cell bees, so this is not a brilliant photo, but you can actually visibly see the difference. So certainly in the beginning, I kept one regular size hive next to a group of small cell bees, and you can always spot the difference. And people near me, they say, oh, your bees are on my garden or in my flowers, and then you think, oh, okay, fine. But how do you know they're actually yours? In my case, I can actually spot the difference because they're noticeably, visibly smaller. So interesting. So these are some of the many methods we all know and sometimes use, chemical methods for treating varroa. Hive cleaners morphed into varroa guard now. So typical chemicals that most of us use at some point in the year. Integrated pest management, that's another method of tackling varroa. Breeding for varroa sensitive hygienic. So people like the great work that people like Ron Hoskins in Swindon are doing, where he's constantly culling and trying to get that trait into his bees. And then of course there's things like small cell. And there was a small fad where you could buy from vets a few years ago, a sort of predatory mite. It didn't last long, and I've read a little bit about it coming back a little bit, but it seemed like such a good idea. They found a particular mite that's endemic in soil, and that seemed to have a positive impact on varroa. And the consequences of not treating, I think, are just dire. If you adopt this kind of Darwinism attitude, I think you will lose probably something like 85% of our colonies if you stop treating. So, although I've spoken about small cell bees, sorry, that was just the wind catching that, sorry. I think about 15% of regular sized colonies manage very well without any treatment. So they have this ability to manage the varroa, and they do, I'll come on to the actual behavior that they actually take on that actually enables them to deal with the varroa. So what do you, the audience, do? Is there anybody here who does not use chemicals to treat their bees? 2. That's quite a lot. I mean, I think I've asked this question of a lot of people, and I've found somewhere between like 1% and 5%. So there's a high proportion of you here. So of the remainder, how many people treat once a year? How many treat more than once?
Depending.
How many people assess the varroa in their hive? Yes, interesting. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you're an interesting group, and an interested group, because I found the results that I've found typically are about 10% of people don't treat, and of the rest, half treat once per season, and about the rest of the remainder tend to treat more than once, sometimes many times. Quite interesting. And the varroa, measuring the varroa, so you've got an informed view of whether you're treating. I would say, you're disproportionately high as a pretty small minority of beekeepers who actively monitor it. Interesting.
I'm surprised it would be as high as 10%. So all the beekeepers that I know and met.
Yeah, and I think, when I scratch beneath this, people who do not chemically treat, you find then they're doing other things. They're letting them swarm, they're doing a brood break, they're trapping queens, so they're maybe not using chemicals, but they're doing something else.
But there is a proportion. I only treat when they need it. So you can't say whether I treat or not, but I've only treated about 5% of my colonies.
Sure. Yeah, and you're in a tiny minority who's...
That's why I have to monitor.
Yeah, and you monitoring and treating accordingly, whereas a lot of people will monitor and still blanket treat. And actually a lot of the MBU advice previously has been just treat everything. And you think if you've got a hive that's low in varroa, just because it's next to a hive that's maybe loaded with varroa, it doesn't mean it's going to transfer. So one of the consequences of treating is, it's a bit like us taking antibiotics. We just purge our systems of a lot of the good stuff. And, there's a lot of good stuff in the hive, even a lot of benevolent mites that piggyback off the back of pollen, lots of fungi, bacteria. So it's a whole ecology of the colony, the hive, is kind of wiped clean to a large extent when we treat. It's a kind of necessary evil, I think, treating, because not treating has its consequences. So our first colony, this is how I came to look into this whole concept of small cell. First colony we bought back in 2011 had an absolutely colossal daily mite drop. And this went on for, actually she lived somewhere between, the mite drop varied between 10 and 50 a day, which is excessive, absolutely excessive. And this queen lasted for 4 years, and her mite drop was colossal, even though we did all of this, which when I look back on this slide, I'm appalled that we just hammered them with everything under the sun. And even with all of this, we were still getting these incredibly high mite counts. She was very productive, bought it from a commercial beekeeper, lovely temperament, lots of honey, but the mites were just unbelievable. So that's this is a year of this, and I just thought, I've got to go and look for a silver bullet. I'm not doing beekeeping to feed the chemical company. So that's what kind of drove me down the road of Small Cell Foundation. I went looking for a panacea, and when I looked across the pond in America, there were these guys that were doing this thing called Small Cell. I knew nothing about it, and I thought, let's give this a go and let's see what happens. And for me, anyway, it worked. So how does it work? There's 3 kind of popular theories. One is that the cell size of small cell is too small. It's too small for the varroa mites to get around, and I think that's kind of, these mites are really tough. They'll muscle their way around the bee almost regardless of the cell size. More recently, I think there's been this concept that the smaller cell bees, like Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, they have a smaller capping period, so the opportunity time for the varroa is less. So that was a popular theory. I certainly subscribed to it until about 2018 with this brilliant researcher in Norway, Melissa Odie. She found this concept of recapping, whereby the bees will go across the comb. When they smell the varroa, they'll punch a hole in the cell. Varroa are very sensitive to temperature and humidity. It upsets the equilibrium, the breeding cycle, buggers the varroa, then they recap it. And Steve Martin's done a lot of talks based on this phenomena of recapping. I think he's doing a workshop at the Honey Show, National Honey Show, how to actually do this really fiddly job. You have to take almost like a scalpel and slice off the cappings and then flip them. You can't tell from the outside, but if you look underneath, you can actually see where the holes have been punched and refilled. So it's quite interesting. But what is interesting is that Melissa Odie, when she did her research comparing small cell with regular sized bees, she found that the small cell did this much more, and it really affected the ability of the varroa mites to breed. So what do the experts say and the commenters? I would say that overall, there's a body of people who are for it. So the ones in green, these are peer-reviewed research papers, and I've put Odie at the bottom. And these are people who practiced it. So the late, great Dave Cushman, he was in the process of flipping all his over to small cell right at the end of his life. Mike Bush, D. Lusby, these are Americans. The Lusbys were the sort of first proponents of small cell in Arizona. And Mike Bush is probably the foremost proponent of small cell. He's written some really good books, Practical Beekeeping, good guy. When you look at the naysayers, without a doubt, these always outweigh those that are for, and there's some prominent people here as well. So again, this is all peer-reviewed research that says, no, it doesn't work. When you Google small cell, it's really interesting. A few years ago, you would just get absolutely pilloried small cell. There was a lot of really venomous stuff that came from a lot of prominent beekeepers. Now, when you Google small cell, it's quite interesting. In the last few years, I think the tide's beginning to turn. As more people are trying it, get a few more positives as well as some of the negative. How do I monitor for varroa? Really simple. Just a traditional varroa tray in, and I just do a mite count. Really simple. I put it in, clean the tray, put it in for 3 days, and that will tell you everything you need to know about your hive's health regarding varroa. And then do it again. Never rely on a single read. I always think, do it once, do it twice. Don't overreact, don't underreact. If you have a very light load of varroa, especially in the summer, it can be deceptive. It will increase as time goes on, as the calendar year goes on. If you have a really high drop, again, don't overreact. Kind of build up a picture. You can bear to do that 3 days, every month, every second month. It'll give you a really informed view. It's much more sophisticated methods. You can use the varroa calculator. We've got CO2 testers downstairs. If you listen to people who know about this subject a lot, like people like Kirsty Stanton writes for Beecraft. She was an MBU researcher. Yeah, she says the traditional corrugated board, very simple, very effective, and you can do it all year round. So you get a window in on the health of your hive. And I've already said, single reads, just be mindful. Don't over or underreact based on a single read. Build up a picture over time. How to interpret the mite counts. Well, the MBU's got a really good book on varroa, and it's quite a heavy read, but and different people will have different thresholds, and you need to be a little bit careful because you think, a small varroa number, a small mite drop number in, say, a nucleus can be quite significant compared to, say, a slightly bigger number in a huge hive. You need to be a little bit sensitive to the kind of colony size and do a little bit of common sense or weighting. But generally, what I say to people is, just use a threshold of roughly single figures every day, any time of the year. If you're in single figures, you're good. If it's double figures or more, it's one to watch. So these were some of our first results. So there's my threshold, roughly 10, 8, 7, 8. And these were the sort of counts. So these were colonies that the previous year, 2013, these are 2014 and 15 readings. 2013, I'd made the regular bees smaller, small cell, so established small cell, And these were the typical mite drops that I was getting. So the bars show the actual numbers. 0 is a 0, and X is where I simply just lost the will to actually go out and measure. I think I had 24 colonies at the time, but the picture for me was really, really encouraging. And then something really interesting happened. That is, colonies that I recently made small, put the small cell foundation and aggressively made them smaller. For about a third of them, I found this huge spike in varroa within the first 6 months. And I think that was just, there's so much going on when I do it aggressively, make big bees small. I think there was a sort of shock to the system for the bees. And so I found that this sometimes happened. You got this huge spike in varroa. I had to treat once more, and then after that, it really settled down. So how might you introduce small cell if you want to? So one thing that's very useful is a ruler, so you can actually measure the cell size. This is one of what I consider to be the more aggressive methods, where you're putting in starter strips, an idea I got from Dave Cushman. And what happens is the bees will use this starter strip. Initially, the cell size won't quite be 4.9, it'll be partway there. And then by resetting it partway down the frame, it brings them down to 4.9. So they're starting off at 5.4. They're using the wax as a template, a bit like you see drone foundation on regular comb. They'll just hedgehog it out, make the cells bigger, and then they'll do a reset, and then you get down to 4.9. Another method is to insert a whole frame of small cell right in the middle of a strong colony, quite aggressive, and just kind of ease them out so you can force out the bigger cells over 2-3 months, and eventually get there. Shook swarm. I'm not a fan of shook swarm. I know people who do it do use shook swarms to initiate small cell. So it's a really aggressive method, and it has lots of consequences for the bees. But my preferred method is to use Bailey comb change, much more gentle and gradual. So Bailey comb change, so that's that last picture here. This is a Bailey comb change where literally you're changing all the comb, and it's an idea initiated by somebody called Bailey. So what you would do with a Bailey comb change, you start off with the original colony here. You do a comb change, so you'd put your 4.9 mil foundation here above it. Let the bees gradually migrate up. When the queen starts laying, you can then intervene, lock her up there, and effectively they're now in the new house, the new foundation, and when you do this, they will go from 5.4 to about 5.1 mils. If they go to 5.1 or less, that's pretty much treatment free. What I advocate is doing this once. You get to 5.1, brilliant. And then in the second year, maybe you're starting at somewhere around 5.1, put the small cell foundation again, and then it'll be complete. You don't tend to get that reaction from the bees with the big spike in varroa. These are some pictures to show. This is when we started off. We were using this split frame and using 2 sets of starter strips to kind of push it on. Measuring, definitely measuring with a transparent ruler. Really, I found this really helpful. At least with a transparent ruler, I could see the bees I was squashing. And then I just put a graduation of 4.9 and 5.1, count 10 cells. I'm working out, try and dead end the ruler. I found that a really useful tool, and I used to measure both sides of a couple of brood frames just to kind of see how far they've actually gone down this regression, 4.9. I always say, you've got to don't be too evangelical. If you're doing this small cell, you still might need to use the chemicals I suggested earlier. You might have to adapt to twin track for the first year, twin track approach. And things I like about it, the really plus points for me anyway, is that it can be carried out anywhere. I think that's a bit of a bugbear, the fact that you might be, if you've tried it on some of your colonies and not on others, you can end up, you've got one set of regular foundation, another set of small cell. That can be a bit of a fag. I think try and keep, for me personally, rationalise, try and keep an apiary the same, either go the whole way or not. It can be a bit of a nuisance when you've got, especially if you're trading frames for any reason. It's definitely not dependent on any particular breeding, selective breeding, and it's not susceptible to any resistance. Once they've got there, it's all about the size of the bees. It doesn't matter about the strain. It's all about the size of the bees. So the type of bees, not material. I started off with buckfast in Carniolan, but now I just use regular local bees, and it's worked equally well. I don't have to spend any money on chemicals. And one of the real pluses, if you treat in the autumn, which some of us do, many of us do, it opens up the autumn. The only thing I have to worry about in the autumn is feeding. I haven't got to worry about feeding and treating, or treating and feeding. I would say that the honey yields are no more, no less. I have smaller bees, but a lot more of them per frame. Temperament, mine are all good. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I don't think it actually makes a difference to their temperament. But for the purists, so for the first 6 or 7 years, I didn't worry about this, but actually Thornes now sell a slightly narrower sidebar. You know, it's not essential to the success of small cell. Slightly narrower sidebar, so the bees were a little bit closer. Everything is smaller with small cell. The bees, the queens, the drones, everything is smaller. And this is interesting. So in the last 12 years of beekeeping, I would say on 6 or 7 occasions, I've managed to get hold of wild, this is a tree outside Reading University that was being chopped down. Very lucky that I knew the tree surgeon. I had a friend who had, who was mad enough to help me lug this cut trunk and put it on his farm. And then when we measured the actual comb inside one of the open branches, we could see that the cell size was 4.9. And in the 6 or 7 times I've actually managed to access comb, this is from bees that were breeding in or swarmed into a manifold the preceding year from an adjoining tree, and according to the house owner in East Reading, that these bees swarm every year. So to test it, where I haven't actually been able to access the comb, I've actually taken bees that are supposedly unmanaged. I literally put them in a hive with just a frame, and let's see what they do. And it's really interesting. You know, they come back and they are 4.9 mil. So there's something really interesting that goes on with colonies that are able to survive unmanaged. That chap, Philippe Solbany at Blenheim Palace, who found 50 Apis mellifera, mellifera, all of those were small cells. So I like to think that there's something going on out there that's really positive about the size of the bee and they're managing the varroa. So, you know, I finish off with these kind of taunting one-liners, what's there to lose, better for your bees and so on. But, you know, to me, it's such a simple choice. You know, we've all got to do this. We've all got to put foundation in. And we don't have to do it in the really kind of structured way that I've depicted. You can just, whenever you do a frame change, you know, a foundation change, you can just go this way as opposed to that way. Cost the same. There's no difference in price. What is there to lose? That's my rhetorical finish. And so sliced bread or BS, I'll leave you with that, but I'll now open it up to your questions. So
what you say is the adverse effect on the colony then if you just shoot swarm into
well, for most people who do a shook swarm, it's just the decimation of all the brood. You know, you're effectively, most people will jettison all the existing brood. You're literally putting a bunch of bees, what the Americans call a package, in on clean foundation. Gone is the pollen, gone is the existing brood. So as well as the resource load, it's the resource loss, it's the shock to the system. I mean, that's to me, that's pretty abrasive, but some do. So.
You say that the bees are naturally choosing small cell. Does that have an impact on the drone foundation?
Yeah, I mean, they are, when I look at the small cell, I try putting in drone foundation and they don't particularly like that. They always take, so with regular sized bees, we've got 5.4 mil foundation. You go downstairs and buy a packet of drone foundation, that's 6.7 mil. With the small cell, what they'll do when they want drones, what they will do is they will literally take a sheet of brood foundation 4.9 and they'll use that as a template and generate 5.6 mil drone foundation.
So the drone stops the same, they're not going to normal brood, the drone stops.
So the drones are
smaller drones.
smaller drones, smaller queens, and smaller bees. Everything is smaller. Any other questions?
Notice any difference in feeding the smaller bees
Do the smaller bees?
take less feed?
No, no, I would say no more or no less. Absolutely, no. I would say they're just like the wider population of bees. Some of them, will come out, turn left and find fantastic sources. Others will, the hive next door will turn right and just be mediocre. When it comes to feeding, there's a small percentage of bees that are just manic. It doesn't matter what they've got in the larder downstairs, they will just take everything down. A small proportion of them, they're just voracious. But those are also what I consider to be like super foragers. They are able to find sources of food externally. So, but in terms of small cell, I would say no difference at all. No. Any other questions?
In the supers, you use conventional
Do I use? And what I do in the supers is I actually use big cell drone, so massive, 6.7, just because it's so much easier to spin out. So above the queen excluder where the queen's not going, I would just put the biggest cell size I can find, just so much easier. And also it means, if you do that immediately above the queen excluder, you never get that pollen arc. So that's a really good tip, I think, Yeah.
Have you ever had a queen called in the supers then?
Yeah, it's such an obvious question, that, isn't it? Yeah. No, I would say, yeah, I would say they are smaller, but they don't go through that queen excluder. When I say that, regular bees, I would say, I don't know, there's between 1% and 3% of them will get through. They either squeeze themselves through or they're a little bit smaller, and it's probably the same for small cell, but not as a matter of course. So in other words, when I put a queen excluder, they stay below. I don't use them, but when I do use them, I say they do as they're told. I wish. No, but with the queen excluder, no, I don't find that they get through. The thing where I came unstuck with the queens was the gestation period. So from egg to hatching with small cell, everything's 1 or 2 days less. So the brood period, the queen gestation. So I've gone along and found that, a queen has escaped thinking I've got another day or two, got that badly wrong. So always a day, 1 or 2 days shorter for the queens. Good. There's you can find us, and we've got a YouTube channel as well where there's all this stuff's freely available. So and if there's anything else, foundations downstairs, if you're interested, I'll be here for most of the day.
Yeah, just a quick one. I mean, obviously, you're running them on a brood, looking in small cell. You're about brood and a half for the broods. Does that make an impact with how much you need, with whether you need brood and a half or?
No, I would say in terms of the overall brood nest, they're pretty much the same, the small cells. So they tend to work to an overall kind of volume, let's say, rather than the number of bees. So I get a lot more bees per frame because of the smaller bees. But no, I think, brood and a half, whatever you've had before, you probably need the same. Yeah. Yes, sir.
If you're producing queens not from small cell but from conventional, that doesn't matter.
Absolutely not. No. So I will occasionally buy, if I've got an angry hive, I'll buy a commercial imported queen, put it in, and it's got the cell size and the managing of varroa. It's all about the worker bee size. So they're the ones that will dictate the cell size. So she will lay accordingly, regardless of the size of the queen. She'll be a larger queen, regular sized queen, let's call it. But yeah, it doesn't make any difference. The breed, the size, no, it doesn't.
If you let them run on and swarm themselves and produce virgin queens, the queens are going to be smaller eventually.
Yeah, almost straight away. If the rest of the colony is established, yes, the workers will build queen cells accordingly. So when I showed you that graphic, my test of wild unmanaged colonies, shove them in a colony and see what they do. If even with a brand new queen, they would still build the cell size in relation to their body size. So that's the predominant factor. Yeah. Good. So we're closed there. There's next talks at 11:30. Tony Jefferson, who's talking about swarm management, swarm control, and then I come back at 1 to do last talk of the day, which is on checkerboarding, swarm management, another take on swarm management. So thank you for your
Thank you.
questions.